Okay, 101, take 2, mark.
To set the stage, we're gonna start with a little video that HALA ALYAN has sent. And I think another important thing to say is the kind of quietness is because of the seriousness of the subject matter and also a legitimate figuring out how this goes. And so I just wanted to put that out in the room so everybody, and on the camera so that people are like, what's going on here? That's what's going on. We're people who I think we're brought together because we agree on a lot of things. And so this isn't an argument, but it's a discussion about how to demonstrate and manifest and cultivate that solidarity. And now I'm gonna shut my mouth.
My name is HALA. I am very grateful to you all for coming together to have this conversation and for being unflinching in a time when there is so much silence and so much fear and so much incomprehensible grief. There is no blueprint for a discussion like this one. And I really believe that when things have been made to seem unspeakable, when they've been relegated outside the realm of discourse, they start to feel impossible to even approach. And so I think conversations like this one are crucial because they are a direct challenge to that. There's a quote by Egyptian activist Ala Abdel Fattah, where he says, any form of political organizing that may solve our global crises has to stem from personal solidarity like this. And I really resonate with that.
Yeah, I think, just thinking about solidarity and how, by the way, I close my eyes when I think, so don't be alarmed. It takes there's so many small and big gestures that signal solidarity, and I think each is equally important, from, the being out in the streets and protesting to, signing letters and petitions to wearing a keffiyeh. That in itself, I myself am Palestinian-American, and I recently was in a space where I felt very alone, and I felt so cold and frankly scared. And but then I looked out into the audience and I saw one person wearing a keffiyeh, and I suddenly felt like, oh, that is precisely what we all need right now, because when you are either a Palestinian or a Palestinian-American or somebody that is a pro-Palestinian, when in a moment like this, you're constantly gauging every room you step into, every interaction you enter into, who is in solidarity with you.
That's really powerful for me to hear you say, because something that I hear a lot of young people say or question is it enough, this thing I can do? And even sometimes, honestly, I find myself feeling like it's not enough, especially now.
Yeah, that's so natural to have those doubts, right?
Yeah, and having listened and love my Palestinian friends, hearing that saying anything right now is transformative, can shift the dehumanization that we are seeing. I recently started wearing a keffiyeh because my friend Nikki, who's Palestinian, gave one to me. And I was riding the train, and I think I was riding the C train, and I could feel people looking at me, which felt familiar. It felt familiar in that this part of me right? My queerness, like my Puerto Ricanness, like all parts of me, like even my gender presentation, right? Like the stare was familiar.
Yeah.
But I also felt like the language of use, like this is happening to them. This is happening to that community. And my hope was by wearing the keffiyeh that I could show yes, but also no, many of us are standing with, this is not just a fringe feeling or a marginalized feeling or experience. No, like my hope was to pull whatever perception, and there was actually somebody on the train that just looked at me and went like quietly like that, but it was in secret.
Like I've grown up in this city my whole life, and I've never felt like I was not alone. And so it does matter, the keffiyeh is because I feel like with me, it just points me out as a Palestinian, and that breaks my heart, because I feel like, oh, they can wear it because they're just in solidarity and no one's gonna kill them for being Palestinian, but nobody's probably gonna kill me either. It's just this.
Well, I mean, it's not a abstract fear in this country. Yeah. You know, I think that it's a marker of racial identity.
Yeah.
And I think but for you wearing it, and for so many wearing it in solidarity, it just brings to mind the chant at the protest, right? Which is that in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. Yeah. Because for so many, this is the defining struggle because of the fact that the contradictions are so absurd between our stated ideals and our practiced ideals. And I think that this is what is so terrifying to so many in political power in this moment, is that it's not just a question of Palestinians, that you have to contend with all of the people who see themselves in this movement and their liberation in this liberation.
And that is solidarity. I think that what happened, and this was probably not planned, but if we recall, I mean, we had COVID. And we were all captive audiences in front of the television. People, we talk about George Floyd, but actually, the first killing that was on a loop on the news all the time was Ahmaud Arbery.
Yeah.
And I watched some of my friends who are not friends of color call me. Said, man, this stuff is still happening. I mean, they couldn't believe it because they'd never seen anything like that. That was a wake-up call. Then immediately thereafter, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. And so that awakened especially a newer generation to what is going on in the world and the injustices going on. And then all of the institutions that then pretended to care, the NFL and everybody else, everybody jumped on the bandwagon. But that ultimately does beget an intolerance. This is the George Floyd video on a larger scale.
Yeah.
So there's a sheer impossibility that you would see that, having seen what we've seen over the past few years, and not want to say, this does not compute. This does not make any sense at all. And I think that's what we're seeing happen. And for those of us who are African American, it came really into fruition during the anti-apartheid movement, because the Palestinian people were in solidarity with the sisters and brothers from South Africa. The PLO offered safe haven for the exiled African National Congress. So when Nelson Mandela comes out of prison, one of the first people he goes to see, so you can't go see him, no, I'm going to see Yasser Arafat because they were in solidarity with us.
One of the most important things, I think, for us in the fight for Palestinian liberation is to ensure that no matter when someone comes to that point of realization, that we have room for them.
Right.
And I think one thing that is so heartbreaking is still the strongest element that we have in mass support for Palestinian rights is the mass killing of Palestinians. We're still at that point where what it will take to bring people to the street is mass murder of a people. And what I hope for in this moment is that this be the last time that murder be the impetus for action.
So to continue this conversation, we have actually a video from Christopher Rogers, who is a Philadelphia-based organizer, part of the Paul Robeson Center, and is an activist and organizer that I have, and an educator that I have deep, deep respect for. He's gonna share some words with us now.
Good day. My name is Christopher Rogers, and I'm joining you from Philadelphia, PA. We are emboldened by the ongoing resistance of the Palestinian people, who have challenged us to anchor our solidarity beyond the immediate urgency and necessity of an enduring ceasefire towards the realizing of the complete end of Israeli-led apartheid and occupation. I think of the sorts of experiences and stories that we hold close that remind us that all that we are subjected to is never a full measure of who we are and what we may make possible within this world. It's a reminder that in every revolutionary struggle, culture is a weapon. Or as Claudia Jones puts it, that a people's art is a genesis to their freedom. Thank you all for your time. Sorry I couldn't be there with you in person, but we will be together in this movement to realize a free Palestine. Thank you.
People's art is its genesis to freedom.
He paused in the video to let it sink in, and I heard you go, ooh, when you said it, because it really is a powerful thing.
I'm thinking about the artists in Gaza right now who have been deliberately targeted. I'm thinking about the Freedom Theater that was raided, the artistic director that was beaten. I'm thinking about Mossab Abu Toa to Rafat. Artists in particular, I think are specifically situated in a way to affect culture. In addition to using the tools that we have, I feel a deep call, I guess, to stand up as an artist for other artists, in addition to as a human first, for other human beings. In conversation, there have been a lot of conversations whether our artists are speaking out or not speaking out. Yeah. I mean, there's 10 questions I could ask right now, but maybe I'll just
Can I, since my career started 25 years ago, I have actively been connected to people in Palestine. And so I've been involved with the Freedom Theater for years, and Giuliano Merchamis, who started it, was a very dear friend who was killed because of his theater. Then Mossab, who you mentioned, Abu Toha, is someone who's very close to me and my family because he started the Edward Said Library named after my father, and he actively chose to model his life after my dad and Mahmoud Darwish, as well as Rafat, who is also an educator. And people have said, wow, these Palestinians have so many brilliant artists and writers. And as I know from my own self, I may be American, but the Palestinian before my name makes everything I do a political statement. So it's one of the hardest things about it, because even if you just want to write a poem about the chickens and the strawberries, right, it's going to be a political statement.
You know, there's much to obviously talk about on the U.S. side, how the suppression of voices, but just to stay where we are, when I heard that the library was destroyed.
Yeah.
You know.
And the first thing he said is, my books are gone, not my house, my books. I mean.
And then the image that was circulating that wasn't from this year of a girl on top of rubble with her book, trying to find her books.
Yeah.
I have experienced, and all of us maybe might have felt that there's a hesitation from an artist's perspective.
Yeah.
That I was curious if you've been thinking about that.
I mean, I have a real, probing curiosity about how to do this, right? Because I think it's really interesting, because this is such a deeply heartfelt and sincere and it's been largely, I think, a very justifiably somber conversation, and that's not mostly the kind of, I'm gonna roll my eyes when I say art, but art that I make. And it's I think there's a real tension between how do you fold what you're seeing in the world into your art if it doesn't feel like a natural fit, and then how do you speak outside of making that art, like you were just saying, right? Of it feels like a less sure footing. I feel like when I can fold something into comedy and say it that way, and go oh, that's the natural way for me to publicly express things I've been thinking about. And then this is a lot harder because I think it requires, in a lot of instances, a lot more like sincerity, and there are not a lot of like corners to poke at or pull at for levity. And so it's like been a really, it's been a horrifying time and an interesting like self-reflection of like, well, how does my voice fit into this and how?
Something that's just really struck me over the last 2 months is how hard Palestinians have to fight to have even just like a basic humanization in our culture. And I haven't been able to escape this feeling, in the Jewish community, we know the stories of, it feels like I know the stories of almost like, not of every person who was killed on October 7th, but like the stories of Israelis whose lives were turned upside down on October 7th are colorful to us. We get the profiles. We know the names of the families and their children. We know what their hopes for the future were. We know details. We know details. We know color. We know texture, and the U.S. Congress has had 2 public vigils to mourn for the Israelis that were killed on October 7th, as they should. Right. And Congress has yet to have a vigil to mourn for the Palestinians who've been killed, as the death toll it's now almost 20 times the death toll on the Israeli side. And I notice it, how hard it is, how hard Palestinians have to work to, like the idea that like only if you tell your story in fiction. And the other thing about it is like, I feel like Israel-Palestine is like one of the most documented conflicts, situations in the world. And it's because like Palestinians have to like hold the camera up all like at every hour of the day to prove that what is happening to them is even happening. And that's why there's something, we were talking about this before we started. I want us to talk about this, about this bearing witness, which is like, we are getting live streamed atrocities on our phones all day, every day. And it's taking, there is a piece of me that's like, you said it before, it's like, there has to be a level, it's so messed up. It's like that there has to be a level of killing for people to be out in the streets and to want to do anything about it. And there is something about like, we should talk about like, what is it doing to us right now that we are watching videos of children suffering, children with their faces burnt off, children who are looking for their parents, children who are like shivering, their whole bodies are like shaking in the hospitals alone. And like, what is it like? There's something that is like, I can feel it like breaking in me of just this like, this gap of like, we can see all of this and we can't stop it.
I appreciate you saying that so much as someone who's been watching it for so many years, and I'm so happy that everyone's joined in, or a lot of people have joined in and see it now, but I feel like I've been waiting. I'm 49 point something, and I've been waiting a long time, and I feel very upset that I still have to see these kids. That's the other thing, you go out in the street and you think everyone's seen the footage you've seen. Not everyone is bearing the same witness for some reason, and it could be just they're not seeing it, but it's also very clear from the mainstream news, I think, that there's a disproportionate number of Palestinians who are getting killed, and I know some of the hostage families, I know everything about them because the news will loop their stories again and again, so thank you for saying that.
Yeah. Part of what we were talking about before is you were sharing, I think this was maybe during the break, how when videos of the lived experiences of Palestinians, when you saw them, or that you were taught to say, well, there has to be, I don't want to misquote you, there has to be a reason?
I'll tell you.
Okay, please.
So I was having a conversation with a person who I love very much, and I was telling her about a young man in Gaza named Khalil who was killed with his wife and kids in their home. He was a teacher, he was an activist, and he did a lot of work with Israelis. So like a lot of my friends who are left-wing Israeli and American Jews have studied with him. Many of them have even met him. He was actually brought in for a blood transfusion. So there's also this there's this beautiful piece of writing from this Israeli activist, Sahar Vardi, who's like, a piece of my blood was in his body when he was killed, which is also just like thinking about what are these ties in this place. Anyways, so I was telling this person that this man who was a teacher and a scholar and wanted, and an activist, and he wanted to go pursue his Ph.D. He was killed in his home. And she said, why? And I said, what do you mean, why? She said, but why did they kill him? And I think that we're just fed this in kind of like mainstream media in this country, this like constant justification, right? So there had to be a reason. Or this constant, the sanitation of the violence, the justification, and she said, well, what, did they give a reason? I mean, the Israeli military lies all the time about why they do that, what happens, why it happens. So I said to this person, what if you just didn't say why? What if we just stopped for a second and actually just took in the fact that I just told you that a person who was a teacher and a comrade to my friends was killed in his home with his wife and kids, and I can't actually give you a reason for that. I don't know why. They're doing this to lots of families right now. I don't know why. I can't actually give you a good reason for it. And there is also something underneath there. It's like, it dehumanizes you that you are desensitizing yourself to that level of violence being committed against other people.
I mean, I think there's so much of that, right? Like so much desensitization and justification of well, there's war. These are the things that happen in war.
Yeah, the thing that is it's just the most absurd thing that I can even imagine. And yeah, like what you're saying with Musab, when he was trying to get out, because his son was born here, has an American passport, he was on his way out and they took him, the soldiers, for a week and beat him and stripped him and all these things. And everyone said the same thing. Well, why? Well, he's a young man, he might be part of Hamas. I said, he's not part of Hamas. I mean, I would know. And then it was he's of the age. He could have been in Hamas. And I was like, why is it qualified?
I've had a lot of hard time kind of finding news sources that people who are kind of entrenched in this line of thinking without a lot of empathy trust. And that's been a real challenge for me. And I think the idea of stopping in your tracks and being let's not ask this question right now. Let's hold this as this is a tragedy that happened, and we can sit with all these tragedies and mourn them all. We don't have to question why. But I've really struggled with some people. You go, these figures seem really devastating, or this video footage seems really devastating, and they go, yeah, but we don't know the context.
Yeah. Probably a week after October 7th, I was talking to a Palestinian friend, and I was saying to him that my Israeli friends are going through the experience right now of going to funerals every day, right? And he said to me, what do you think we do all the time? And, anybody who just tuned into the news on October 7th maybe doesn't know that every single day this year in the West Bank, the Israeli military killed a Palestinian person. Every single day, sometimes more than one person in a day. And, if we were talking about Musab, he wrote, I think, a story in The New Yorker that has really stayed with me that was actually not about the destruction of his library, it was about the building of his library.
Yes.
And he talked about how, for years, he has been slowly going abroad to bring these books back to build his library. And
we gave him so many books, and everyone gave him, it was
yeah,
just
he
so
said he
cute.
had whole suitcases of books, but it's I sometimes actually struggle to articulate what it makes me feel. I've studied this issue for years. I worked at an Israeli NGO that actually focused on issues of freedom of movement in Gaza, and there's the level of inhumanity of what the people of Gaza have been subjected to under this siege for over, almost 17 years. The level of inhumanity that is the daily reality of the siege, not being able to just go visit your family who live in the West Bank or, you know, in Jaffa. The idea that like you need permission to go, the Israeli criteria, this is before the total siege, right? A first-degree family member who is dead, dying, or getting married. And if you're lucky, they'll give you a permit. I mean, those like very basic things that like people have been trapped in this place and denied like basic foundations of life and well-being.
Can I just thread 3 things I just heard? Wow, I thought I was whack at doing the whole thing.
No, you're facilitating.
No, but we were talking about this before. And something I heard you say is, you said feel like 2 or 3 times when you were talking. And the space in which you are speaking from is a space of, what I'm seeing is that you are in touch with your own humanity. And that when you see these videos of a child, by the way, having a right-sized reaction to having their family members be slaughtered, to their physical pain, that we also, for people watching this, are having a right-sized reaction.
Absolutely, thank you for saying
to horror and to a live stream genocide. One of the first things that I noticed was that, yes, the mainstream media was treating this as if this all started on October 7th. But if you knew nothing, about, and you just started tuning in from October 7th, very clearly, as you said, you saw who was being humanized and who was being dehumanized. And so when I see people marching, when I see young people specifically standing up for a free Palestine, I'm seeing them having a right-sized reaction to a horror that is it's almost resetting the acceptance of violence. And I, as our elected officials and the apparatuses of oppression, try to lower the bar on humanity. Part of what I feel hopeful, or maybe I shouldn't say hopeful, energized by, is the energy in the streets, and specifically from young people, whether they are newer to this issue or not, stating in very real and simple terms that this is not okay. Because it's on my radar. What does it mean to have to perform your dead? What does it mean to have to show that video of a mother who said, we don't need to film anymore?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was...
They've seen everything there is to
What did she
see,
say?
and they're still letting it happen. I mean, it speaks to the fact that this is, how much documentation is required to extend humanity to a people. And I think what is so infuriating about this moment is it's not a competition of which people should be given humanity. It's the extension of an existing humanity to all people. And it's so framed that to extend something to Palestinians is to deny it to someone else. It's simply to say that that which anyone deserves, Palestinians deserve too. And it's hard to see just how much suffering has to be on a loop for us to start to recognize that maybe these people do not deserve such a thing.
I'm so excited for us to get to hear from Rabia Ighbariya. The Harvard Law Review should have published his article.
Hi everyone, I'm Rabia Ighbariya. I want to start by quoting from Rifat Al-Arir to ground this conversation. Rifat writes, "If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a tale." For the past 2 months, we've all been witnessing our people in Gaza being obliterated and maimed en masse. And this made me reflect and think about our abilities and our limits to put ourselves in their conditions, in their shoes, in their positions, and the things that they're enduring and the violence that they're going through. And this has also led me to think about the ways that we Palestinians more broadly are able to relate to each other under this system of fragmentation and ongoing Nakba. So I want to invite particularly the Palestinians in the panel to reflect on how do we as Palestinians continue to relate to each other under the Nakba, under this condition of forced fragmentation. Palestinian lives are still valued differently. So I'll leave you here. Thank you so much for having this conversation.
Well, I think the two of you just got an invitation, so.
I'm trying not to close my eyes, but that's the only way I know how to think. But the sort of link between the dehumanization of Palestinians and the fragmentation of Palestinians, I mean, I think that they work together really well, because part of the project is to keep Palestinians fragmented, right? First of all, the West Bank and Gaza in itself, right? The political factions that exist in Palestine, these are all age-old divide and conquer tactics that have certainly done a great job of weakening us. Then on top of that, you know, Palestinians in the diaspora, Palestinians in refugee camps, like there are just so many different ways and levels of fragmentation. And in addition to sort of like not allowing us to pool our resources and to work together to like tell our story and to work together to influence the powers that be, like all of the ways that, you know, we could potentially influence not only public opinion, but actual policy and what have you, that fragmentation prohibits that and then trickles down into the way we're seen, which is, you know, as non-human.
I think that for me personally, and I wrote about this in my book and my play, and a lot of people were like, why are you writing about anorexia and your own psychological problems? And I was like, because I had been to Gaza and I wanted to suffer because I was like this privileged girl from the Upper West Side who was Palestinian, but had all the sort of good things of life. And we have people who are in these circumstances that are so horrifying that you can't even fathom them. And then there's our suffering, which takes a different flavor and seems a little bit more self-involved. And there's the sort of layers in which we carry the same trauma. 2 years ago, my sister-in-law's first cousin, Shireen Abu Akleh, was killed. She was the maid of honor at my brother's wedding. Even the fact that she was an American citizen, a Christian, a female, and a journalist, all of which we thought would make America care, didn't make America care. And so, I don't know.
No, that's so powerful. You know, I think about it a lot lately, I guess, as a mother. And like, I've gone to the West Bank almost every year my whole life and spent as much time there as I can, because that fragmentation and dehumanization, like, how do you resist that? That's the only way I know how, is to like try and go to the source of what we are in some sense. And how do you pass that down to, you know, how do I pass that down to my daughter? I want her to have a connection to her heritage. I want her to have a connection to other Palestinians, to Palestine, while also knowing that to be Palestinian is to be seen as less than. And so it's a very tricky balance. How can we as Palestinians share our stories and the stories of our victims in a way that everyone in our community, not only to mainstream audiences as well, like I feel that the inability to share our stories in a way that resonates and that reaches.
It's been really meaningful and powerful and like personally effective to me, seeing the way many Jewish people have like disentangled their own line of thinking from like the idea that Jewish identity is bound up in a nation state of Israel, right? And that like Jewish safety globally is contingent on or justifying for Palestinian suffering and death. And so like that is one of the things that to tie kind of this, you know, to put a little knot here and then tie it to what Simone was saying before and what Mark had said about a young kind of coalition of people across various demographics. That has been really moving to me, to see Jew, and I say as a Jew, but like I think my like body and face and all of me says as a Jew, so like I don't know if that's like a necessary caveat, but like it is really moving to see like Jewish people go like this, I'm gonna stand up and say, like, this isn't being done on my behalf. I don't want this done. I don't want it being done in my name with our American tax dollars to fund this. And that has been like a really, so like, yeah, just the idea that like Judaism does not entail like an aggressive military in the state of Israel.
Like, I've grown up, as many Palestinians, like, in order for us to understand Zionism, we had to like learn what the Zionist movement was and what was written and what happened and the history of it. Because we see it as the movement, and it's a political movement.
So
I mean, I know you're not speaking for every Jewish person.
No, that's
ever.
okay. I like the like liveliness of the conversation too. I think growing up, and maybe I know you have a very specific case of childhood education, but I think a lot of Jews grow up being taught that like the state of Israel is really important to Jewish identity and the safety of Jews and like prosperity of Jews everywhere in terms of being able to like flourish and recover from the horrors of the Holocaust. And I think that I see it as an adult. I try to like think about it more as a place and a government, right? Like Israel, it feels kind of like American patriotism, right?
Yeah,
like it feels like growing up with American patriotism, but for a different country. And that's what helps me kind of peel it back a lot, right? Because you can go, oh, I can be a critic of things in America. I can be a critic of the United States government. I can be a critic of the way the United States treats people of color and people of all communities that the kind of white Anglo tradition is pushed to the margins. And like, I think applying that to Israel is like a really like reasonable entry point, right? To be like, I'm going to treat this place like a nation rather than like an idealized concept. And I'm speaking very broadly too, but I do think there is that pervading, that it is like a not infrequent teaching. And I think like it's to go like, think about it this way, like Israel has like an aggressively right-wing militaristic president. Yeah. And when America has that, you go, you can't do that.
But if I may, we're seeing, and I think something that I found a lot of comfort in is seeing a young generation of American Jews rejecting in very clear terms that ideology. And we were kind of talking about that together is Jews who have grown up being fed propaganda, which honestly I had an awareness of, but was not any near my personal experience. So I wasn't coming to this with that kind of quote unquote baggage or from that place. My politics is just liberation for everybody and a politics of love, which is really just values. But you and I were having a conversation specifically about how Jews, younger Jews are coming to this moment from different places.
Yeah, I mean, not to like be weird and quote your dad, but I feel like there's like this essay, I mean, I bring this up all the time when I have conversations with people. Like in the opening of this essay, he talks about the idea that, I'm gonna butcher it, but I'll just summarize it, which is like, basically he opens by saying that in pro-Israel Zionist communities, people have the privilege to interpret the meaning of this word based on whatever it means for them. So like a conversation that I've had probably 1,000,000 times throughout my life is, what does Zionism mean to me, right? Inside Zionist communities.
From when you were young.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, there is actually like a rich tradition with a lot of diversity of thought within what the Zionist movement was, right? Like, we read these different thinkers, we know that there were debates, but we don't consider what the material impact of this movement was on the people whose lives, whose land, whose society was uprooted by this movement, right? So like the idea of what actually the material reality of Zionism is not like included in those conversations. Palestinians don't exist in those conversations. Like that's why at this point, I'm not that interested in what Zionism means to me. I'm an anti-Zionist because of what Zionism means for Palestinians, because of what it actually means in its lived reality every single day. I feel like I also have to say I believe that Israel does not keep Jewish people safe, Jewish Israelis or Jews around the world. So I'm in this fight also because I want Jewish people to be safe, and I think that we've been sold a lie that we're going to be safe through this, apartheid system, in which right now, if there's anything I learned from October 7th, it is that Jewish Israelis are also not safe living on the necks of the Palestinian people. Jewish Israelis are not safe in when this level of violence and oppression is happening all around them, and they've literally built the walls so they don't have to see it. But it's always been there. It's always been, it's always been there. I just think it's an absolute tragedy of Jewish history, the idea that immediately after this catastrophe that our own people experienced after the Holocaust, that another catastrophe would be created by another people.
And now we have a video from Noura Erakat, a human rights lawyer.
Hi, everyone. I'm so sad that I can't be with you this evening, but still draw inspiration from your convening and mostly inspired by the energy that worked to manifest your gathering. I want to comment on 3 House resolutions introduced between November 2nd and November 28th that culminate in a statement that equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. A few things about these resolutions. The first is that they're all introduced by Republican members of the House. The second is that none of them are tantamount to law, and so these are not binding. They are statements within the House of Representatives at a very particular point in history that is part of an effort to deflect from where our energy should be in the condemnation of ongoing genocide of Palestinians, and in a way that tries to cast our protest as a problem rather than as part of the solution. Significantly, all 3 resolutions draw on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which in sum equates the critique of an ethno-national project predicated on the removal and dispossession of Palestinians to anti-Jewish bigotry. And within that definition, it specifically names that the critique of Israel is tantamount to anti-Semitism. I leave it here for you to unpack and discuss this, which your very presence and the legacies of your protests and our collective protests work to vividly demolish.
God, vividly demolish is such a good phrase.
Noura's the best. She's such a badass.
Let's kill her.
I think people have been beaten down and put in a state of fear for speaking out about this. And as far as the resolutions that were mentioned, they're meaningless. They're just resolutions, but symbolic of what Republican right-wing evangelicals would do. So wait a minute, you would pass that type of resolution, but you would not decry a war has caused the cancellation of Christmas in Bethlehem. But you're evangelical. And so we're going to listen to and give credence to those very people who would take away our voting rights, take away women's bodily autonomy, take away marriage equality. The list goes on and on and on. It actually was not that long ago. This thing of Zionism, anti-Zionism being anti-Semitism, it was on the books at the United Nations. Yeah. Zionism is a form of racism.
Yes.
And H.W. Bush decided that shouldn't be anymore, almost single-handedly decided. But what is the world saying today? There have been countless, speaking of resolutions, before the United Nations from around the world saying this must stop. And the only nation that is exercising its power, its veto power, to prevent it is the United States. I want to say something. I respect President Biden. He's appointed more African-American women to the judicial bench than anyone in history. That's important for all the rights we're trying to protect. But I think he is because of the generation he's from, is fighting a ghost. AIPAC they called Hill Harper and offered him $20 million to run against Rashida Tlaib. And he said no and exposed it.
I mean, the starkness of offering a candidate $20 million to run against the champion of Palestinian human rights and the only Palestinian serving in Congress. But there is, I'll give you an example. I'm a state assembly person. I serve in a position that many New Yorkers might not even know exists, which is the assembly. It's a state version of Congress. And even at my level, when I have introduced legislation, when I have made statements that critique Israel's treatment of Palestinians, the rapid and the nature of the response and the scale of that response speaks to a political apparatus that is still quite well-funded, quite strong, but is increasingly becoming more and more separated from public sentiment. And that is something where I see it has never been the case in this country while I have been active in politics, where the majority of Americans are recognizing the humanity of Palestinian lives. I've never seen that before, where a majority of Americans want to see a ceasefire. The fight that we are going to have at every single level of government in this country is a fight between public sentiment and political convention. Because how is it the fact that we had a poll come out that showed majorities of Republicans and independents wanted a ceasefire, and still we had only about 60 Congresspeople in support of a ceasefire out of 435 in Congress and 100 in the Senate. And I think that speaks to the fact that for so many people, you were saying it earlier, Joe Biden is fighting a ghost. For so many people, Israel is not a place, it is not a country, it's an idea. And you see that in so many politicians' answers to the questions around Israel, is their answers were written 20, 30 years ago. They speak to a reality that does not exist.
Right.
They pledge fealty to the idea of a two-state solution, irrespective of the fact that a second state for Palestinians is physically impossible because it's not even a contiguous piece of land in this moment between where Palestinians live. So that all tells us that there is this disconnect. And what these resolutions, thankfully, they are, as you said, not binding, but they also, to me, speak of a fear amongst political class across this country of a discourse that is rising that seeks to question this convention.
Yeah, and I think as someone who sort of straddles the generations here, I think that it's interesting to watch because everything that you're saying, my entire life was just accepted. Joe Biden fighting a ghost, that's that whole generation. And for me to see the younger generation come in and right away be like, nope, that's not reality, and push back against it. But like it's this old generation and the new generation, and that's where the tension's coming in, and I think eventually it will.
Well, I mean,
I don't know how.
I think we have to be careful to not, for a long time, Democrats subscribed to an idea that demographics were destiny. We would hear about the fact that as this country becomes more of color, this country will become more liberal. And that erases the fact that color is a construction, that people who were of color at one point then became white. And I think it also erases the fact of how people see themselves. And Trump has sizable support amongst different communities of color. So while today's youth will hopefully become the old of a generation to come, I think we also have to make sure that we do the organizing, we take the action, we say that which needs to be said, and do not simply trust that the future will be delivered to us, but to know that as we hear and see how clueless these so-called experts are, that we can't trust anyone else to bring that future. It has to be us.
I have to just also say one thing. When you talk about the kind of the gap between political will and public sentiment, there is also something for me here that, and it also ties to what you were talking about before, which is like, there's something that really freaks me out about the idea that, President Biden always says that he's doing what he's doing in the name of Jewish safety. I feel like what actually some of these House resolutions also expose is the theater of the Republican Party, who has this broader agenda, as you already mentioned, of stopping the teaching of any critical history in this country, undermining public universities and public institutions, these attacks on all of our, safety and well-being on every different level. And I think there's also something here for me where it's like, okay, then why is it that the political will isn't there? I think we also need to talk about, it's not just the Israel lobby, it's the largest pro-Israel lobby in America is actually Christians United for Israel, right? So and let's talk about who has a fantasy idea of Israel, right? The role that Israel plays also in Christian Zionism is not about a real...
When we went back to my family home for the first time in 40 years since my dad left, our house was not owned by an Israeli family, but by the International Christian Embassy. And we're Christian and evangelical even in my family. And that was more upsetting and overwhelming than maybe finding my best friend from New York's last name on my house in Palestine. But thank you for bringing that in.
So you're one of the co-founders of IfNotNow. And in the days after October 7th, Jewish Voices for Peace, IfNotNow, I was not even aware of these groups, and found, as someone with Jewish heritage, I found a Judaism that was familiar to me, that I did not see that reflected at all, because any criticism, as folks have said, any criticism of Israel was equated with anti-Semitism, which it's almost mind-boggling how far that illogic has gone, or that lie has gone. But in just the statements in the early days, and though an organization is not just reduced to its statements, but they were really powerful, and I think really necessary. The work that you're doing and anti-Zionist Jews are doing, and my friends are doing who are anti-Zionist Jews, is incredibly important. But I specifically found it almost like I could breathe, because you cut through that noise, which really was just a distraction, which I think the resolution is just a distraction.
I had a friend call me, I don't know, like a month or so ago, a couple weeks after October 7th, and she said, I've been able to tune this out and to look away, and now that I'm not looking away, I don't know how to be Jewish. And she called me and she was like, how have you stayed Jewish when you know about the atrocities that Israel is committing in our name? And I have to say, there have been moments over the last 2 months, where you see Israeli soldiers, installing a Hanukkah, like a menorah on the roof of a demolished, bombed out Palestinian building in Gaza, where there was just video that's just like bone chilling of an Israeli soldier singing a Jewish prayer inside of a mosque, like in the muezzin's microphone. And I'm pretty sure it was the Shema. It was like, these are like our sacred prayers. And there have been moments where I see that and there is a piece of me that just wants to give up. Because I'm like, they got the military, they've got the power. There's a lot of investment in, this fusion of Judaism and Zionism. And then I went to this protest that was organized by Rabbis for Ceasefire and IfNotNow and Jewish Voice for Peace and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice in New York, and Shorish, which is a new Israeli anti-Zionist group. Everyone's coming out in this moment. And for every night of Hanukkah, for every candle, we had people get up and teach pieces of Jewish texts and traditions that speak to a vision of liberation and justice for all people. We had one of the rabbis opened it up by saying, the holiday of Hanukkah, we put the commandment is actually not that you have to light candles, the commandment is that you have to put the candles in the window. And that is because you need to, it's about sharing light with the community, but underneath that is also the knowledge that you will be safe. You will not be attacked for putting that ritual object in the window, which is so interesting because there's so much messaging right now, so much fear-mongering about we're not safe, we're not safe. And like, even in our own traditions, we have these, counter-narratives that exist within our own tradition that have been hidden from us. Just, we had teachings about the sanctity of all human life, about the mandate to fight for the release of captives. The idea, they want to say we don't care about the hostages. We care about the hostages. We want all people to be safe and free. And I think that it's, the first moment I was actually able to cry after October 7th was when I went and said the Mourner's Kaddish, the Jewish Mourner's Prayer, outside in public with IfNotNow for the Israelis and the Palestinians who had already been killed that week. And I think there's that reclaiming of ritual has been so profound, it's just been really profound.
What you just described and what you alluded to in terms of the Judaism you had met and become familiar with, I mean, that is part of the human struggle for transformation. Right here in this very sanctuary, James Cone was, Professor Cone, who was a Union. And he is considered the first to articulate what Black and liberation theology is. Because in the old ways in which we were taught, slaves obey your masters. There were sections of the Bible that were kept from our enslaved ancestors to keep us enslaved. But once it was revealed that the scriptures were a liberation document, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, that has a transformative effect on this. And so the experience you describe is the most healthy one. What did Netanyahu do? He goes to the worst parts of the scripture to justify. And when I heard that, even though I'm not Jewish, I could picture a number of Jews around the world seeing that in its starkness and saying, wait a minute, I don't know if I'm really about this life that he's talking about. So it exposed. But I think this, again, is an opportunity. We haven't seen anything like this since Rabbi Heschel marched with Dr. King in Selma. So they asked me to go to the Manhattan Bridge with them a few weeks ago. I was there for that purpose, because we must stand together. And in spite of the divisions that exist, 90% of African Americans and over 70% of Jewish voters vote the same way. Yep. But yet, there are those who would like to keep us divided.
And our last video is a message from artist and activist Ty Defoe.
Bonjour, Anin. My name is Ty Defoe. I'm coming to you live from New York City, Lenape-Hoking, here on Turtle Island, colonial known as the United States of America, and also Canada. I'm really inspired by the folks that are coming together today. Being a Native Indigenous person myself, I also think about what it means to be in relationship and community to each other and the land. So my heart and spirit and love goes out to all those folks that are thinking about resistance, the fight, and also creating peace at the same time. I think about sayings from my own community in the Great Lakes of northern Wisconsin about if you are not dreaming 7 generations ahead, you are not dreaming big enough. Miigwech, thank you so much.
I was really struck by Ty talking about dreaming 7 generations ahead. And just quickly on the drive here, I saw a huge murmuration, like thousands of birds in flock together. It was the biggest murmuration I'd ever seen on the drive to this talk today. And I learned that these intricate patterns that birds make, they're so in sync with each other, but they're created because the birds are paying attention to the 7 people or the 7 birds, I should rephrase that, y'all can edit. The birds are in tune with the 7 other birds around them. I've studied Latina lesbian elders and their activism, and there's a particular elder, Ada Bello, who's a Cuban lesbian, and she was one of the co-founders of the Philly chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis. Now that's how far we're going back in the LGBT movement. There were many Stonewalls before Stonewall. She's telling me this story, she didn't have her citizenship yet. And one night, the police had again raided this gay bar. And so there was a confrontation or a meeting with the police chief to say, our people are being beaten and arrested and, harassed in these public spaces for being gay. And she flippantly says, I couldn't go to the meeting, I just drove the car. And I heard that, and she didn't realize what she did. And I said, Ada, did you hear that? But you drove the car. And she's like, well, I wish I could have done more, And so I feel that because you care, you always want to do more. But in this moment, I remind myself of Ada's car. I remind myself of, in Latin America, the pots and the pans that people hit. Who doesn't have a pot and a pan in their house,
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Please pick up.
No, I was right there with you. I was just saying someone's got to drive the car, right? If no one drives the car doesn't get driven.
Somebody's got to feed people, and make sure there's water. Yeah.
Such a beautiful way of.
I think if we look at this situation, even a few years ago, we did not see the outpouring that we're seeing now. And each generation's progress is its own reward. So now this generation sees this. This will come to an end. That's what we have to believe. And we talk a lot about religion and all of that, but the most significant part of religion is faith. And believing that there is something better if we keep striving. I can't help but use the example of my own ancestors, many of whom were born in bondage and died in bondage for generation after generation after generation, but they never gave up because there was still a belief that eventually our time will come and we will be free. All of these struggles are the same. Our brother was speaking on behalf of the indigenous people in this country, same struggle. We're talking about the Palestinians, same struggle. African people, same. Ultimately, there has to be a conversation even about repair for all of our cultures that still suffer under oppression and colonialism. But we have to keep fighting, and each generation should fight to its last breath and then pass the baton on to the next one coming. So in the church, there's a spiritual we sing, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. And one of the verses is, every round goes higher and higher. Every round goes higher and higher. We're here, the latest rung on that ladder.
Just that exercise of imagining is in itself sustaining. When Martin Luther King got up there and delivered his I Have a Dream speech, that was an imagining of a future that didn't at the time look like it was possible, right? And to put something forth that you envision as a place to eventually arrive, I think is itself somehow sustaining and mobilizing. And you mentioning that your ancestors, some of them were born in bondage and died in bondage, and it's our brothers and sisters who have suffered for generations and who have, arrived somewhere else.
What I see now is something I never thought I'd see. Seeing my niece and nephew not have the insecurity that I had because I didn't fit in, and now even in this country, young people sort of celebrate their identities in a way that we were forced to assimilate and hide. And I see that in my niece and nephew. I can already see 2 generations.
I think there's also a real beauty in the idea of the 7 generations, which you've, I think, really latched onto, right? Organizing for 7 generations, because it kind of beautifully and hopefully presupposes there are going to be 7 generations, right? This violence will end, and there will be a peace and safety and freedom to follow. And I think that's like a very beautiful hopefulness that's like tucked right into that, like we're organizing, right? We're planting planting seeds that won't bear fruit in our lifetimes, or we won't see all the fruit they bear in our lifetimes.
Our demand is the most basic demand. It's a demand for a ceasefire. And this saying reminds me of the necessity of grounding that demand is the first step in recognizing the humanity of Palestinians. And to think of 7 generations akin to what that humanity will look like and the steps towards it, it requires an end to the siege. It requires an end to the occupation. It requires an end to an apartheid system of government. And knowing those things and ensuring that we are forever fighting the present and building the future together. Because if we disentangle those, we could end up in a situation where we have ended the massacres of this moment and not understood the context that allows for massacres to take place on scales that in the moment seem unimaginable, but continue to repeat and escalate. And the other point that some of this brought to mind is, Mariam Kaba speaks about hope as a practice, hope as a discipline. There have been so many mornings where I've woken up feeling bereft of any hope. But in thinking of her words and the necessity of practicing the world I want to see, even in the moments where I don't believe it is possible, so that when that work builds upon itself, you get that much closer and you can return to that place of sincere belief. And I think it's critical for us, as we've now gone months into a genocide, that we remember we can build that world, and from the building we can find inspiration.
I think there's something that's so painful about the idea that the call for Palestinian freedom is constantly recast as a call as a call to kill Jewish people. I mean, just the idea that, a call for Palestinians to have freedom everywhere between the river and the sea is a call for Jews not to have it. There's something so painful about that to me. And I think when we talk about, first of all, I think it speaks to this moment that we have so many politics around us that are zero-sum, that tell people you can only have safety if these people don't have safety. You can only have wealth if these people don't have wealth, right? We see this kind of zero-sum thinking all over the place, and nobody's getting their needs met. Nobody has safety. Nobody feels okay right now. It's something is fundamentally not working. So I think when we talk about thinking 7 generations ahead, that's the scale of change that we need to see. I mean, dismantling all the things that you just talked about, that's not something that can happen overnight. And I think it's hard for Americans to think that way. We like sound bites. We don't really like history. We don't, and there is something about being confident in committing to a very long-term struggle that's very hard and very important. And I couldn't help but think about a piece of advice that I was given recently by a South African Jew who was in the anti-apartheid movement. And he basically said to me that being in the struggle is where you create the vision for what the struggle is for. And I think, I often hear, it's does this movement check all my boxes before I show up to the protest, right? What did they do to include me? Well, it's if you're not in the movement, you have to be in the movement for the movement to include you, your values, your vision. You have to build that movement that you want to be a part of. And so I think also when we're just talking about what is hope and what gives people the nourishment to be in the struggle, be in it, create the movement and the vision that you want to see in it.
And I just want to say that my father's funeral was in this church 20 years ago in this room. And that for me, being here with you guys, there's something magical about that too. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's what I said.
It is significant that we're having this conversation in this space where Dr. King's words were used as his death warrant 1 year to the day when he spoke here and spoke out against the Vietnam War. He obviously was one of the martyrs of our struggle, a world struggle, as are those we are watching today being killed, martyrs of the struggle. So I don't think he would distinguish himself even from those who are suffering. And I'm sure as time went on, he would have probably had an opportunity to be more involved. He was invited to Israel. He, even in the 60s, was wise enough not to go and waited. And he's even said that he didn't want his visit to be interpreted as an endorsement of what the Israeli regime was doing. And so we have every reason to believe, there are even some right-wingers who put it out there, Dr. King would have been with the Christian Zionists. And his own children said, no, you got him all wrong. That's not what he would have done. So these are just a few of the words he shared here, April 4th, 1967. We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked, and dejected with a lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of men does not remain at flood, it ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is adamant to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. There is an invisible book of life that faithfully records our vigilance or our neglect. Omar Khayyam is right. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on. It's a wrap. All right.
As a rabbi, part of my work is being with people in the last moments of their lives and being with families in the first moments after a death. Grief is sacred, and every human being and every family deserves dignity in life and in grief. My heart is with every single family in mourning right now in the Holy Land. Not every family gets to mourn with dignity. That's true in Israel, Palestine, and it's especially true in Gaza. People in Gaza are in mourning, and at the same time, they don't know if they or their children will survive the night. People are grieving as they are violently displaced en masse, and as they are denied access to food, water, and medical care. People are grieving as they witness mass slaughter and genocidal violence all around them, as entire family lines are annihilated. To grieve is to sanctify life. The Jewish prayer for mourning is called the Kaddish, which means sanctify. And right now, I think we sanctify life collectively by fighting for it, by calling for a ceasefire, and by calling for an end to the conditions of occupation, apartheid, and siege that deny Palestinians dignity in life, in death, and in grief, and that keep all people in the land from lasting mutual safety.